Good afternoon, buenas tardes. It's siesta time, right? My name is Esmeralda Santiago, and this is my story. I was born the year that Puerto Rico was able to vote for a local man as their governor. I was born in that year. He was someone we had great expectations for because he sold my parents and my grandparents and my great-grandparents on the idea that Puerto Rico would be a separate nation from Spain, where we had been for at least 400 years or more. And so within several months, what happened was that he actually betrayed us, and we became an associated state of the United States. Over the course of many, many governmental issues and laws and arguments, and including near civil war in Puerto Rico, we reached to the age when I am born, which is the mid of the century, of the last century. And I was thinking about this the other day because I was born 50 years after the invasion by the US Navy in Puerto Rico. I was born in the year that we were betrayed and we were no longer have any possibility that we would be an independent nation. But all that stuff that happened before I was born, that my parents lived through, that my grandparents lived through, my grandfather and my great-grandfather and my grandfather and my grandmothers and great-grandmother were all alive during the invasion. And so they were in the history of my lifetime. So they, I was really too young to understand any of it. But for some reason, it did become a part of my life. And I think this year, 2018, we observe, some of us, and some of us celebrate the 120th anniversary of the invasion of Puerto Rico by the US Navy and the fact that we are American citizens, at the same time as we're going through this devastating, terrible time on the island that was caused by nature. Yes, it was. But one of the many destructions during that hurricane were man-made and caused by the things that have happened in the process of trying to make money out of a beautiful little island that has been forgotten by many people until this terrible disaster. I wanted to start with a joke. I don't have one. I have not been able to joke very much since September 20th of last year, because almost every single piece of news that comes to me is sad or tragic. And yet, I go to the social media and I see Puerto Ricans celebrating Christmas with handmade maracas and clapping and dancing with whatever is left of their clothes that were not damaged, destroyed, or flown away. And I realize, oh, I am both of those people. I am that person who can celebrate with maracas made from found objects, but at the same time, I cry almost every single day that I think about what's happening there. Why am I telling you this? Why is it part of writing a life? I spent the first half of my life just living my life. I was born in Puerto Rico. I was at 4 years old. My parents moved, there by then was 4 children, to a place called Macún in Toa Baja, which is just outside of San Juan. At the time, it would take approximately 4 hours to get from Macun to San Juan, but right now you can do it in less than 45 minutes by a car if there's no tapones, bad traffic. And so my earliest memories are actually of that place. And that place, Macun, was very much like the place where my grandparents lived, where my great-grandparents lived. And so I have in my being, in those very important years of my life, the conscious years, when you begin to understand and notice and see and question and challenge, all that mostly happened in that place, in Toa Baja. My grandfather, Higinio, and I will name all of them because this is part of why I am writing a life. Higinio Santiago Pagan, when the United States invaded Puerto Rico, was making 17 cents a day by cutting cane in the huge sugarcane fields that were near his home, where he was born, where his father was born, where his grandfather was born. My grandfather, my grandmother were former slaves, and so they had that experience because in Puerto Rico, they were not, the law said you're free in 1873. However, you owe us 3 more years to pay for all the benefits we have given you, like food and a place to live. So 1876 was actually the effective date. So my memory, even though I was a little kid, it's in my memory, it's in my genes somehow that I knew this. And so I am completely obsessed with that period of Puerto Rico because I loved my grandparents. I loved my great-grandparents. My great-grandparents, who were my mother's people, Pablo Santiago Mendez and Fidelia, were descendants of Spaniards. And they were very pale-skinned, very black hair on my Pablo, my great-grandfather, and my mother had the same kind of much lighter skin than I do. But from my father's family, I have this wonderful color, piel canela, that my father used to call piel canela, skin of cinnamon, which I always loved. But it was a famous song at the time when I was a little girl, and I thought it was written for me. But it wasn't. But many years later, I dated the guy who wrote that song, by the way, because I just needed to get close to it. So we live in this place, no electricity, no running water. Most of our neighbors are a little bit older than my mother, who was at the time, maybe about 20 years old and already had 3 children, was pregnant with a 4th. And so I grew up around these elders who were part of the history of Puerto Rico, who had lived it, even though they didn't know that it was history. To them, it was their lives. And so because of them and the age that I was, I just used to hang out with them a lot. And so I heard a lot of things. I learned a lot of things that still shock me, that I know, things about medicines and plants and how to fix certain things that sometimes stun my husband because I don't seem like to be the kind of person that could fix anything, but somehow it's in there, right? So that's what I learned in that place. And my parents, while I'm growing up and learning and being curious and figuring things out about life and asking a lot of questions, I think that's when I began to be a writer without knowing that's what it was. I was surrounded by illiterate people. Puerto Rico was really about 75% illiterate still in the beginning of the 20th century. So most of those people didn't know about books. They knew about life. And it turns out that here I am. I'm writing about history. And I think I am writing about their lives, and I'm writing about my life. We live in this place until I'm about 13 years old. By that time, my parents have 7 children together, fighting every single day that they got together with each other. How they ever did it to have 7 children is still a mystery to me. And at this age, I should know. But it's just somehow they found moments of love enough to then, have children. So they have 7 children. And my youngest brother, whose name is Raymond, Raymond has an accident. His foot is very badly damaged. All of this, by the way, all these stories are in my book, When I Was Puerto Rican, but I wanted to expand on it for you. So my brother has this terrible accident, and we have to do something about fix this foot, because in Puerto Rico they wanted to amputate his foot. By that time, my mother's people had all gone to New York, and so she brings him to New York. He is fixed as a fiddle, and so she realizes this is the best place in the world. We are leaving Puerto Rico. All this fighting with my husband, they were never married. They were together, common law. Just all this fighting, all this disagreements, all this awful life living in this place with no electricity and no running water. We're going to go to New York, where my family is and where miraculous things happen, like save my son's foot. So, I was not happy about that. Not that I didn't know what New York was. It was just the place that my cousins and my aunts and uncles lived, and they used to send us packages with stuff that we couldn't find in Puerto Rico. So it was like a place that you got things from, right? I didn't know a sense of it. So we go, my mother is absolutely determined to do this, and my father refuses to go with her. And so now 7 children, 1 woman, one very unhappy, challenging child, moi, and the other children who were much better children to my mother than I was at that time. I was 13 years old. I did not speak English. I had not seen snow. I had really only been to the city of San Juan and Santurce, where at the time the tallest building was maybe 2 stories or 3 stories high. So the whole idea of skyscrapers was not even in my imagination. And so one day in August, we leave Puerto Rico, and it seemed like 2 or 3 days. We flew, but I have now learned that it was only about 6 hours. And so we arrive in New York on a very rainy, muggy day that felt very tropical to me. But there's my grandmother and her boyfriend, my mother's mother and my grandmother's boyfriend, Don Julio, whom I didn't know and had never met. And my grandmother, whom I never really had a memory of because she had left when I was a little girl. And the first thing that I noticed when she hugged me, welcoming, was the smell of liquor. And so I said, this is not a good thing. This is not looking too good right now, that this lady, very nicely dressed, because my mother and my grandmother and all their aunts and sisters, and they were all seamstresses, and so they were all very fussy about their clothes. So she looked great, but she didn't smell very good. And so then we go to Brooklyn, and we end up in Brooklyn in this little apartment that was going to house my mother and my 2 younger siblings, because my mother had left the other ones in Puerto Rico. She couldn't afford all of us. And the reason she took the 2 younger ones is, of course, because they were the younger ones. The reason she took me is because she thought I was going to be too much trouble with whoever would take me, because I was not a good kid. So we're in this place, and I'm really at 13. I mean, I had really just turned 13, just maybe 4 months or so. I already knew things were not looking good to me. You know, it was dark when we arrived there. The apartment was it was just cramped. You had to lock like three or four locks, you know, to close the door because it was dangerous to go outside. And I grew up just going into any neighbor's house. They never locked their doors. They kept them open. You can talk to anyone. If you had if you had a glass of water, you could go to anyone really in your neighborhood and say, may I have some water from, you know. And so this concept, the first thing that my grandmother was probably going to be incompetent in taking care of us in this place that's looking kind of scary because you can't go outside. And even when you go outside, it was cement and like hard edges and no horizon, because a city doesn't give you that. It gives you a labyrinth. But I was used to the horizons of this countryside that I had grown up in. I was not a happy child at that time, especially when the next day I was allowed to go outside for a little while, and there was this little girl jumping with a rope, just all by herself, you know. And so I'm just kind of standing. I was kind of shy, but I didn't say anything to her. But she came over, was very friendly. She said, would you like to do this? I said, well, sure, you know. And I was really good at it, but I'm doing it. And so she asks me a question that still reverberates. ¿Tú eres hispana? Are you Hispanic? And I said, no, I'm Puerto Rican. And she said, oh, here we are. In the United States, we're all Hispanos. You know, if we come from Cuba or from Peru or any of the Spanish countries, we are Hispanos. And that moment, it proved to me this was not going to be a good thing for me, that already just from going across the ocean, I am not the person that I was just yesterday. I was a Puerto Rican girl in Macun, and all of a sudden I am an Hispana in Brooklyn. And what does that mean? What do I do? What happens next? Well, the next thing that happens is my mother says, whatever you do, don't become an Americana. And I said, okay, well, what does that mean? She says, well, you know, you have to learn English, and you have to go to school and graduate from high school so that you can get a job in an office, not in a factory where I'm going to be working. But I don't want you dressing like the girls with the skirts up here, and none of the makeup and none of the teased hair. Remember, this is the 60s, you know, they're still doing this stuff. And so you can't do any of that stuff because that's not decente. You're not a decent Puerto Rican girl if you do that stuff. So all of a sudden, I realized, okay, I am this person. That girl said I was that person. My mother says I have to be this person, but I cannot be that person. And so what do I do? Well, what I try to do for the next few years is to try and figure that out. And I learned English very, very quickly because my mother needed me. And I needed to translate for her. And even though I didn't know any more English than she did, her attitude was, you're younger, so you're going to learn it faster. So any English that you hear, you know, just make sure, don't forget it. I'm like, okay, I'll try that. So we would go to a factory where she was trying to get work, or we would go to the unemployment office, or quite often we would have to go to the welfare office, in which I would then have to translate whatever she said. What happens when you're a 13-year-old child from the countryside, you move to the city, you're a questioner and a curious kid and a challenge to your mommy, and you're in this room with somebody who is asking you what I considered impertinent questions, which if I had asked it, it would have been an impertinent question, but this person was asking all these kinds of questions. And I realized, sitting next to my mother, that my mother cannot take care of me because she needs this lady or this man to sign off on some money, or for us to get shoes for school, or for me to get a little paper so that I can get free lunch in school. My mother here we are in this big city where I don't understand the language, where it's this white cold stuff is falling down from the sky and it's kind of slippery, and what's happening to me? Well, what happened to me is I had to become someone, because there were so many questions to me about who I was. I've become a hybrid. I've become a Puerto Rican who lives in the United States. I'm a Puerto Rican who thinks in Spanish, writes in English. I am a Puerto Rican who dances the salsa, who eats the arroz con gandules, who loves the el gran combo, and the same Puerto Rican who loves opera, who has pizza, and who wears short skirts every once in a while, and makeup. So this process is my history. It's my life, but it is my history. I am creating something out of this life that I hope becomes a model for certain people, because I realized that I had to make up a lot of stuff as I went along. I was a reader. My biggest, the best thing that happened to me the first few months of being in the United States was the public library. If there are any librarians here, I thank you from the bottom of my heart, because all of a sudden I found a place where I could find information that I could not get at home. My mother couldn't tell me what it was like to live in the United States. She was in a factory 10, 12, 15 hours a day, trying to make enough money for her 7 children, which then became 8, which then became 10, 9, then 10, and then 11, until she had 11 children. She couldn't tell me. My grandmother was impaired. My sisters and brothers don't like to hear me saying this, but you know, I'm not ashamed of the fact that she was an alcoholic, but I'm really angry that she was an alcoholic when we needed her. So I could not learn about life from her. Don Julio, her boyfriend, he was very nice. He was a sweet man. He was a former boxer, and so anybody could say something to us, he would beat them up if he needed to. I mean, so I felt protected by Don Julio, but he couldn't tell me what it was like to be in the United States. He hardly spoke English himself. And so the library provided me with information, and I began to read about girls like me, except that they were not like me. They were Irish. A tree grows in Brooklyn. They were Carson McCullers in the South. They were girls who had the same kinds of feelings and questions and preoccupations that I had, but they did not have my history. They did not know Spanish. They did not jump from one culture to another. I was the nice Puerto Rican nena decente at home in our apartments. The minute my mother locked the three locks after I leave, I became an Americanized girl. I actually did roll up my skirts so that they would be short. I would put on makeup, and I would bring Pond's cream in my bag so that I could remove it before I'd go home. And I became a challenge, an even bigger challenge for my mother, because all of a sudden I had all this power, the power of language. And so she went from this to that to kind of this in my vision of her. She had been the big goddess in my life, and all of a sudden I realized, okay, I can be a goddess too. And I have 2 languages. And so our relationship really became even more difficult for the 2 of us, because we loved each other, and I still love her even though she's gone, but we could not connect our experiences to one another's, because she was in her 30s, let's say, by the time that I left home. She was 36 and had 11 children, by the way. so so that was that person. And then who was I? Who was this person? And I knew from all the reading that I was doing that in the United States, it was really important to know who you were. It's really, like American people are like, they really need to know that about themselves, and they like to know that about other people. And in Puerto Rico, we had, as I remember it, it was more of a communal thing, like we were all family, and so we didn't have a distinction, from each other. And if you were, the big distinctions there were class. We were we were landless peasants, and then there were people who were rich and owned things like houses and cars and jobs, things like that. But other than that, I didn't really feel at that time that I needed to define myself, because I was living within the definition of what it was to be a Puerto Rican girl, the child of campesinos with no land. And so that was it. That was, but in the United States, I was constantly being asked where I was from. I didn't look Puerto Rican, because their vision of Puerto Rican was very different. I never asked, what does that mean? Because it didn't matter to me. It was much more offensive that they would take my Puerto Ricanness away from me by telling me that I didn't look to them like a Puerto Rican. And I tried very, very hard to try and understand all these kinds of things going on within me at the same time as I'm trying to achieve in this culture, in a culture in which I was invisible. Yes, there was Ricky Ricardo, but that was it. Every time I read the newspapers, it was not good news about Puerto Ricans. It was always something bad we had done. And at that time, they used to say things like, so-and-so, Puerto Rican so-and-so murdered so-and-so. It was always, if they put your name, if they put Puerto Rican on it and then they put a name, usually what came after wasn't they won a prize or they wrote a book or, they're an accountant, nothing like that. And so my process, my life, my history was trying to understand all those things and trying to make them real for me, and trying to, at the same time, achieve something beyond what I saw around me. I did not want to be a 17-year-old girl with a child. I did not want to be a welfare-dependent person of any mother or motherless. I did not want to live in communities where, in order for me to feel safe, I would have to not only lock the doors, but I had to lock the windows and put bars across them. I do not want that life. I know what freedom is like, and that is not freedom. And I don't want those barred rooms to be either my apartment that I pay for from my sweat, or a prison, which was the other option. I was very aware that the expectations of people like me were so low that just about any little achievement I could get to would be like a big prize for me and in the eyes of other people. The expectations were what kept me going, because I was stubborn enough to not want people to confirm their low expectations or also their fears. I mean, people were afraid of me. I am the least afraidable person you will meet. I'm not, I don't know karate. I mean, none of that stuff. I'm really just kind of a quiet, shy kind of person who would not challenge you unless you really do something that makes that happen. But I mean, I will defend myself, but I will not challenge you. And so those kinds of things were what was churning and churning and churning in this life for the first 38 years of my life as I'm trying to achieve. I go from Brooklyn 2 years, year and a half after I arrived. I'm at Performing Arts High School, where I actually learned how to pronounce English, because by the time I arrived there, I could read at a 10th or 11th grade level, but I could not pronounce anything because in school I would not speak because I had such a heavy accent. But at Performing Arts, they taught you voice and diction, and so I was able to pronounce things like K-N-I-F-E and not say Kenife. So after that, I'm constantly working because I knew in the United States, you have to work. You have to work. That's it, because I didn't want to go through the humiliations that my mother went through, begging for anything. So I was never going to do that. I was going to work. And so it took me 10 years from the time I graduated from high school to get to a full-time college, but that was Harvard University with a full scholarship. So, thank you, and yes, bravo, that's what I said. Yay! Why did I choose going to a place like that? It's because I knew that just saying that I came from there, it already made things different for me whenever I would try to get a job, because for me it was always about getting work. Get through Harvard, meet the love of my life, who's standing right there, or sitting right there, nodding. And we begin a film company together that we still run. And then all that time, there was one thing that I knew I was never going to do, and that was to have children. I did not want kids. I had done enough diapers. I had done enough, the croupy coughs in the shower. I wanted nothing to do with that. So now we have 2 children. Actually, 2 grown-ups. But when our first child was born, I looked at him one time, 3 in the morning, Boston, winter, cold. And I'm looking at this child and going, who is going to tell this child his mother's history? Because it doesn't exist. Even if I'm a great reader, I was not finding a lot of information about us in English, which was the language that I spoke to my husband because he doesn't speak much Spanish. Who is going to tell my child my story when he can understand it? I don't know that, that I will be still hanging around here when he can understand it. And so I put him down for his nap, and I wrote an essay about feeling like I can't let that history be erased just because I live in the United States, I speak English, I live in the suburbs, I drive an SUV, all the things that I never ever imagined I'd want to have because I did not know they were in my future. But the one thing I did not want to let go of was the things that we forget when people die, or when we move away, or when we start our own lives and create our own stories. So that's how I became a writer. I really, at about my age, I was about 38, 36, 37, 38. That's when I began to write essays about my story, about what it was like to be in my little town, my little suburban town, to the post office to drop off a package to my mom or a letter to a friend or something, and the postmaster or the post person who has seen me there at least every week would always ask me where I was from. Always. Oh, so where are you from? I don't think it's because I changed my hairdo all the time, which I do, but I don't think I would look that different. But there was something about that question that made me wonder, oh, okay, I think what he's saying is that I don't belong here. That's the question. It's not where are you from, it's what are you doing here in our little suburban town. And so I began to write about that experience, about I belong wherever I am, basically. So if I'm here, I belong here. Sorry, if you don't like it, tough. But so I began to, again, challenge those kinds of questions that people gave to me, but the questions I gave myself about my history, about what was happening, and began to write these essays and began to publish them just wherever people would place them. Happened to be, at first, the local news shopper. Then it went to the Boston Globe and the Christian Science Monitor, New York Times, so on and so forth. But the interesting thing is I then get a request from Radcliffe Quarterly to write an essay. They were doing a whole, the magazine, that month's issue would be about work. And could you write something about work? Because the editor was somebody who knew me, and she knew that I was just always working. Even in my time when I was in the university, I was carrying a full load and a full-time job, 40 hours and a full-time honors program at the same time, and having a good time also during the few hours that I could cut away to do that. So she said, why don't you write about work? And so when I started writing this essay, what came to me was my mother wanted to work. That was the first sentence that came to me. I'm going, wait a second, I'm supposed to write him about me, c'est moi who has to tell this story. But then I remembered how hard it was for my mother to get work in the United States. A woman who was undereducated, who had one fantastic skill, and that was she could sew. So she was an excellent seamstress. She says to me many years later, I could take apart a sewing machine and put it together again, and and it'll be fine. So I realized, okay, I'm going to write about her. And from that essay, an editor got in touch with me and said, we're interested in you. We're interested in your history. Would you consider to write a memoir? So I said, no, I'm too young. But she said, no, well, it's not about, it's about the experience. Your life experience is interesting. And so that's how I began to write when I was Puerto Rican, which when I wrote it, I really wrote it with the idea that 11 other people would read it, me and my 10 sisters and brothers. And nobody else cared about Puerto Ricans in the United States and would not read this book. But they did. You did. Many of you did. Not only you did that, but you felt connected to my experience, that my experience was not quite as isolated as I thought I was, that we had so many moments that we could share, the challenges with our mothers, yes, our challenges with our siblings, yes, our challenges in our communities, yes, our challenges in our histories. It was amazing to me to know that I was not alone in the United States when I began to write about being alone in the United States. How are we doing with time? 10 minutes, okay. So that's my history, and that's my story. And it took me 3 memoirs to get up to the age when I'm 28. I did not know that I had such an adventuresome life. But I think all those years of collecting stories, of listening, of asking, of challenging, not only the people around me, but challenging myself, I think that's what provided the opportunity for me to then become a writer. And I have not looked back since. I have now, it's been, 1898, the invasion. 1948, I was born. 2018, 120 celebrations or observation of the invasion. And I'm now a writer, half my life writing about the first 120 years in Puerto Rico. And that's what I write about. I write for my grandfather Higinio, for my grandmother Margarita, for my other grandfather no, great-grandfather Pablo, my great-grandmother Fidelia, for my grandfather Isidro, for my mother Ramona, for my father Pablo, and for my 10 sisters and brothers. And turns out that I'm also writing for you. So thank you. Thank you. Turns out we have time for one or two questions. Somebody who has a burning question? Yes, there's somebody here.
What did it feel like when you got accepted to Harvard?
What?
Did you know how important it was?
What did it feel? What did it feel?
Like when you were accepted to Harvard, did you know how wonderful it was?
You know, I was completely stunned because I did not think that they would accept me. But I sent the application. I went through the whole process because a good friend of mine encouraged me to do so, because I kept saying, well, you know, if I'm going to have to quit my very good job to go to school full time, then I better go to like a big university. I'm not going to go to some place that nobody ever heard of, because I wanted to continue, you know, getting better jobs. And so that was, you know, it was exciting. I mean, I was like, yay, now my future is now secured, I thought, you know. So as it turned out, it's okay. It turned out to be well. Yeah. And one last thing. Oh.
Do your siblings write?
There's a microphone.
Oh, do any of your siblings write?
None of my siblings write professionally the way I do, but they're all really good writers. We are a very emotional, I would almost say operatic family, and we all express ourselves very, very openly to one another. And if you follow any of my siblings on Facebook, you will learn that they really write well, and they just, you know, they're very open about their lives. It's really wonderful. Any other?
I have a question. You've had so many extraordinary accomplishments. Did you have a mentor? Where did you get your drive? Because you clearly stated it wasn't from your abuela.
Yeah. I think I got my drive because I did not want to be poor ever again. And we were so poor in Puerto Rico, but there I did not know I was poor. And then I came to New York, and then I realized, oh, we were really poor in Puerto Rico, you know. And then I realized, oh, we're really poor in Brooklyn, but it's a different kind of poverty, because in Puerto Rico we never had to ask anyone to help us, because we had family, we had friends, we had neighbors. You know, my father had a job, those kinds of things. You know, when they were not making a lot of money, but they could support their families. We come to Brooklyn, and all of a sudden we're alone. And so I said, never again. You know, so that was my drive, was to just not to be poor. And that's a big drive for somebody like me, that you're constantly, I don't live feeling like, oh, a trapdoor is going to open and I'm going to be back down there where I can't go to the supermarket. I'm going to be hungry. I'm going to be too cold. I don't feel that way, because I feel like now I have some ways, you know, if I did become as poor as the Puerto Ricans are right now, I lived, that's how I grew up, with no electricity, running water, you know, cooking on an open fire. So I'm not afraid of that anymore. But there was a time in my life, in my 20s and 30s, when I was afraid of that. And that was my drive, was to just never be that person again.
Last question.
Can you talk about the difference between the real characters and the imaginary characters in your life?
Oh, it's my husband. His name is Frank Cantor. Well, I write fiction and nonfiction. I've written 3 memoirs. I'm in the process of writing a 4th. I have written 2 novels, and the most recent novel is called Conquistadora, and it begins in 1844, Puerto Rico, and it really is, you know, without sounding flaky or anything like that, although I can be at times, I think I am speaking about my imaginary ancestors because I don't know who they were. I can only go up to Pablo, Fidela, Higinio, and Margarita because they were illiterate. We didn't have, they were not the people who were in the history. They did not exist in the history because they were poor people that nobody really cared about. And so they come to me in my dreams, they come when I meditate, they come when I'm just walking in the woods, which I do from time to time. And so I imagine them, and then I write about these people because I feel like they are in me, even though I don't know who they are. So my imaginary ancestors are constantly around me and whispering in my ear, and that's what they do, and that's something that I value greatly in my life because where else would it come from, So thank you so much for your attention. Really appreciate it.